Old Betsy. Chapter 1: A Gilded Facade. On a day when the sky boasted an uninterrupted expanse of azure and the sun cast a warm, inviting glow over the earth, the affluent coastal neighborhood seemed to embrace a sense of tranquil luxury. It was as if the day itself had been tailored to accentuate the opulence of this enclave, where sprawling mansions basked in the serene light and manicured gardens flaunted their vibrant colors. On such a day, the arrival of Evelyn Masterson in her sleek, midnight black Porsche Panamera seemed almost like a scene from a glossy magazine, each detail meticulously curated to project an image of unparalleled luxury and control. Evelyn, with her expertly styled hair cascading in loose waves and her nails adorned with a flawless French manicure, was the embodiment of elegance and poise. Beside her, bags from the most exclusive boutiques, Gucci, Prada, Versace, whispered tales of lavish spending and a life draped in the latest fashion trends. The neighborhood through which she drove was a testament to opulence and prestige. Sprawling lawns led up to multimillion-dollar mansions, each boasting its own unique architectural grandeur. These homes, with their expansive windows and custom-designed exteriors, stood as monuments to the wealth and status of their occupants. The meticulously maintained gardens, bursting with vibrant blooms and sculpted hedges, added to the aura of affluence that permeated the air. Pulling into the circular driveway of her own residence, a stunning three-story villa with an enviable view of the shimmering ocean, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her home, a symbol of her success and determination, was an architectural marvel, blending modern elegance with timeless sophistication. Stepping out of her Porsche, her designer heels clicked against the pavement, echoing through the stillness of the affluent neighborhood. Her presence was a familiar spectacle, yet it went largely unnoticed by her wealthy neighbors, who were wrapped up in their own displays of extravagance. Evelyn strode into the house, an air of impatience surrounding her like a cloak. Her designer bags landed unceremoniously on the floor next to the plush sofa, a stark contrast to the meticulous order of the lavish living room. Her keys followed, clinking against the glass surface of the coffee table. The interior of the house was a testament to her impeccable taste. As she looked around for her husband, Paul, the familiar, unwelcome sound of the typewriter reached her ears. Her eyes closed briefly, a silent expression of her growing disdain for that incessant clacking that had become more unbearable with time. Turning the corner, she caught sight of Paul in the office, his figure almost melding with the old typewriter, nicknamed Old Betsy, that had been his constant companion for almost a year now. Paul, absorbed in his typing, seemed oblivious to the world around him. Old Betsy, a vintage model found at an estate sale, seemed to hold him in a trance. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him, her eyes reflecting a mix of disgust and resentment, not just towards the machine, but towards the man who had become a stranger to her. Composing herself, Evelyn slipped into the role of the loving wife. She approached Paul with a practiced warmth, her smile concealing the coldness in her heart. Leaning down, she planted a kiss on his cheek, her arms wrapping around him in a feigned embrace. Paul's response was distracted, a simple "Hey hun," without breaking his focus from the typewriter. His fingers continued to dance across the keys, each stroke echoing through the room. "How's the book coming along?" Evelyn asked, her voice laced with feigned interest. "Good, very good," Paul replied, his tone enthusiastic. "Made a lot of progress today." Evelyn pulled away, her smile never wavering. "Don't work too late," she advised, her words as hollow as her emotions. "I'm going to change for the gym, meeting the girls." Paul's only response was a distracted "Okay, love you," his eyes never leaving the typewriter. As Evelyn turned away, her expression morphed back into a scowl. Old Betsy had become a symbol of her growing resentment. Once, she had admired Paul for his success as a real estate investor, his charm and good looks making him the envy of many. She had been the one to catch him, a prize she had worn proudly. But now, that typewriter had taken her place. Paul's affection and attention, once hers, were now reserved for his writing. She felt sidelined, replaced by the clacking keys and the endless sheets of paper. Her attempts to introduce him to the modern convenience of a computer were futile. Paul claimed the typewriter had character, a link to the past and a source of inspiration. She hated old Betsy, the other woman. In her mind, Evelyn began to justify her actions, her decisions, the path she had started to tread. The reasons she told herself were laced with self-pity and a warped sense of entitlement. The choices she was about to make, the secrets she harbored, were, in her mind, a response to the neglect and the emotional void Paul had left in their marriage. As she ascended the stairs to change, a complex web of emotions and plans churned within her, setting the stage for the dark events that were about to unfold. Chapter 2: The Other Side. The Porsche's glossy black finish stood out like a sore thumb in the modest neighborhood, its luxury a stark contrast to the simple, blue-collar homes that lined the streets. These were houses of hard-working folks, each one telling a story of everyday struggles and simple joys. The lawns, though well-tended, lacked the professional landscaping of Evelyn's affluent area. Children's toys were scattered in some yards, and family cars, models years behind Evelyn's Porsche, sat in driveways. Evelyn's car was parked outside a small, nondescript house. The dwelling itself was a far cry from the opulence of her own home. The windows needed cleaning, and the garden, though tidy, was nothing more than a small patch of grass with a few resilient flowers. Inside the house, the scene was equally unimpressive. Dishes were piled up in the sink. The living room was adorned with posters of scantily clad women, their glossy smiles a contrast to the dullness of the surroundings. The decor was an eclectic mix of cheap furniture and outdated fittings, a stark reminder of the different world Evelyn had stepped into. Upstairs, the muffled sounds of passionate lovemaking filled the air. In the throes of ecstasy, Evelyn and Steve, her much younger fitness instructor, were lost in a moment of reckless abandon. Sweat glistened on their bodies as they moved in unison, the cheap bed creaking under their weight. Finally, Steve finished with a cocky grin, looking down at Evelyn. "Tell me that wasn't the best you ever had," he states, his voice a mix of arrogance and satisfaction. Evelyn responded with a faint smile, assuring him he had indeed rocked her world. Steve, 10 years her junior, was the epitome of physical perfection. His body was sculpted and toned, a result of hours spent in the gym. He exuded a raw, youthful energy that Evelyn found irresistible, if only for the physical pleasure it provided. As Steve excused himself to the bathroom, Evelyn watched him walk away, her eyes lingering on his perfect form. She had seduced him easily, their relationship purely physical, fulfilling her neglected desires. She knew Steve was smitten with her, even suggesting she leave her husband for him. But Steve, for all his physical attributes, could never provide the lavish lifestyle to which Evelyn was accustomed. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to her husband, Paul, and the damn typewriter that had driven a wedge in their marriage. She blamed Paul for her infidelity, for her descent into this sordid affair. If only he had paid her more attention, satisfied her needs, she wouldn't have strayed. But here she was, in Steve's humble abode, a world apart from her own. Getting dressed, Evelyn prepared for her walk of shame. She concocted an excuse to leave before Steve could invite her to dinner, a routine she had grown accustomed to avoiding. She didn't need a dinner date, she needed an escape. Exiting the house, she caught the eye of a neighbor across the street, watering his lawn. His gaze, possibly judgmental, possibly indifferent, weighed on her. She donned her dark sunglasses, masking her emotions, and slid into her Porsche. With a roar of the engine, she sped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a life that was as foreign to her as the neighborhood she couldn't wait to escape. Chapter 3: An Unexpected Evening. Evelyn's return home was laden with a sense of dreary predictability. She expected the usual, a quiet house, a husband lost in his world of words, and the maddening sound of the typewriter that had, in her mind, usurped her place in Paul's life. But as she stepped through the door, the scene that unfolded was startlingly different. Paul stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed, his face lit up with a broad, genuine smile. The sight of him so vibrant and attentive was disarming, throwing Evelyn off balance. His first words were an apology, laced with sincerity. He expressed regret for being distant, for being engrossed in his writing, neglecting the woman he had vowed to cherish. Evelyn, speechless, was drawn in by a familiar and tantalizing aroma. Paul led her to the kitchen, where a sumptuous dinner awaited, meticulously prepared by his own hands. The table was set elegantly, the food looked and smelled divine, evoking memories of happier times. The effort and love poured into this gesture were overwhelming, almost bringing her to tears. As Paul pulled out a chair for her, the evening took on a surreal quality. He spoke to her with a tenderness she had long missed, complimenting her beauty and expressing his love. It was like a window had opened to the past, to the days when they were deeply in love, before old Betsy had become the center of Paul's world. Dinner was a delightful affair, filled with laughter, shared memories, and meaningful conversation. It was as if they were rediscovering each other, peeling back layers of distance and silence that had accumulated over time. Later, in the bedroom, their rekindled passion was intense and profound. Evelyn experienced a depth of emotion and pleasure that she hadn't felt in years, not even with Steve. In Paul's embrace, she found the love and security she had yearned for, the sense of belonging that had eluded her. Lying there, wrapped in his arms, Evelyn was flooded with a mix of emotions. She felt a deep sense of guilt over her affair with Steve. Contemplating the honesty that had always been the foundation of their relationship, she was torn about whether to confess her infidelity. The fear of losing Paul, now that she had rediscovered the depth of her love for him, was paralyzing. Ultimately, she decided to keep the affair a secret. She resolved to end things with Steve the next day, to close that chapter of her life for good. Her heart and mind were clear, Paul was her one true love, and she was determined to recommit to their marriage fully. As the couple drifted into a peaceful sleep, the silent typewriter downstairs, an ominous presence in the quiet room. Then, in a moment that breaks the serenity, a key strikes the paper, imprinting the letter K. Chapter 4: The End of an Affair. The morning sun streamed through the windows, bathing the kitchen in a warm, golden light as Evelyn and Paul shared breakfast. They were like a couple newly in love, exchanging smiles and gentle touches. Evelyn felt a sense of triumph, believing she had reclaimed her husband from the clutches of his typewriting mistress. Life, she thought, was finally back on track. After breakfast, as she walked past the office, Evelyn's gaze fell on the lonely typewriter. It sat there, innocuous yet symbolic, beside a stack of papers, Paul's completed novel. She couldn't help but give it the middle finger, accompanied by a wicked, triumphant smile. In her mind, it was as if she had vanquished a rival in love. Humming to herself, she ascended the stairs for a quick shower before heading out. Telling Paul she was off to the gym, she received a promise of dinner waiting for her upon her return. Their parting kiss was passionate, full of renewed love and desire. However, her destination wasn't the gym. Instead, she found herself back at Steve's modest house. He greeted her at the door, shirtless, his chiseled body on display. But as Evelyn stepped inside, her demeanor was serious, a stark contrast to their usual heated encounters. Steve, mistaking her visit as a prelude to another passionate rendezvous, moved to kiss her. His shock was palpable when she pushed him away, her face set in a firm expression. She broke the news to him: their affair was over. She needed to focus on being a wife, and their time together was to remain a secret. Steve, initially in denial, paced the room, his emotions raw and unfiltered. He had harbored hopes that Evelyn would leave Paul for him, but her words shattered that illusion. Evelyn, attempting to soften the blow, offered him money, a gesture he took as an insult. His outburst, accusing her of treating him like a male prostitute, took her aback. She tried to explain, but her words only fueled his agitation. A tense moment unfolded as Steve's grip tightened on her shoulder, his eyes burning with a mix of love and madness. Evelyn realized too late that she had underestimated his feelings for her. Her attempt to extricate herself from the situation only escalated his emotional turmoil. Finally managing to break free from his grasp, Evelyn coldly told Steve that he meant nothing to her, hoping that her harsh words would sever the ties between them. She left the house quickly, leaving behind a stunned and embittered Steve, his face twisted in a mask of hatred. As she drove away, the gravity of what she had done and the potential consequences of her actions began to weigh heavily on her. She had ended the affair, but at what cost? The look in Steve's eyes, that blend of love and insanity, haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this might not be the end of it. Chapter 5: Nighttime Whispers. Evelyn and Paul's reinvigorated relationship was flourishing, each day filled with romantic gestures and affectionate moments. They dined at elegant restaurants, strolled hand in hand along the beach at sunset, and each night they rediscovered each other's love, reigniting a passion that had long been dormant. One such night, after a blissful slumber in Paul's embrace, Evelyn awoke, her throat dry and in need of a drink. She tiptoed out of bed, careful not to disturb Paul, and made her way to the kitchen. The house was enveloped in a serene quietude, broken only by the distant, soothing sounds of the sea. Upon reaching the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator. The light from within faintly illuminated her surroundings, creating a gentle, comforting ambience. She grabbed a bottle of water and quietly closed the fridge door, turning to head back to the sanctuary of their bedroom. As she passed the open doorway of Paul's office, a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease washed over her. The typewriter, sitting in the shadows, seemed to exude an almost palpable presence. She shook her head, chiding herself for letting her imagination run wild. But just as she was about to dismiss her apprehension, a single key from the typewriter clacked loudly, piercing the silence and sending a jolt of fear through her. Frozen in place, Evelyn's heart raced. She cautiously turned back towards the dark office, her eyes fixating on the silent typewriter. Questions raced through her mind. Had she really heard it, or was it a trick of her sleepy state? She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a piece of machinery, incapable of intent or action. But as she stood there, battling her rising fears with rational thoughts, an unexpected gust of wind slammed the office door shut with a startling crash. Evelyn let out an involuntary scream, her grip tightening on the water bottle. Paul, awakened by her scream, hurried downstairs, concern evident in his voice. He found Evelyn, pale and shaken, staring at the now closed office door. She quickly explained what had happened, her voice quivering with a mix of fear and disbelief. Paul, ever the rationalist, chuckled lightly, attributing her experience to an overactive imagination fueled by late-night movies. He walked her through a logical explanation: the typewriter was just an inanimate object, and the door slamming was a result of the breeze from an open window. Feeling slightly embarrassed but reassured by Paul's calm demeanor, Evelyn allowed herself a small laugh at her own expense. Together, they ascended the stairs, their conversation light and filled with affection, the unsettling events of the night fading into the background. However, in the quiet office, a more sinister scene unfolded. The paper in the typewriter, previously blank, now bore two letters, K and I. Chapter 6: New Beginnings and Old Shadows. In the serene morning light, Evelyn and Paul's kitchen was a haven of warmth and affection. They sat at the breakfast table, surrounded by the comforting aroma of coffee and the remnants of their laughter, which had filled the room just moments before. The renewed joy and intimacy in their relationship were palpable, a stark contrast to the distance that had once chilled their home. Paul's gaze rested affectionately on Evelyn, who was playfully wrapped in his shirt. He smiled warmly. "I never imagined that shirt could look so sexy until I saw you wearing mine." Evelyn, her eyes sparkling with happiness, responded with a light-hearted smile. "I like the scent of you on it. It's like being enveloped in your embrace all day," she said, her voice a tender melody of love and contentment. As they continued to chat, Paul's expression grew more serious, yet his eyes remained soft with emotion. He took Evelyn's hand gently in his. "Eve, I've been thinking a lot about us, about our future together. I feel like we're at a point where we could maybe start thinking about having a baby?" Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. Overwhelmed and ecstatic, she leaned forward, hugging him tightly. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes," she exclaimed between fervent kisses. Her voice was a symphony of excitement and affirmation, echoing around the walls of their kitchen. Their tender embrace was a symbol of their renewed commitment, a testament to the love that had weathered storms and emerged stronger. The idea of starting a family, once a distant thought, now bloomed with possibility and hope. As Paul got ready to leave for the publisher, they shared a lingering, heartfelt kiss. "Your novel will be a hit, I know it," Evelyn said, her words laced with unwavering support and pride. Paul smiled back at her warmly, before stepping out into the morning light. After waving him off, Evelyn closed the door and turned to face the day ahead, her heart light and full. But this peaceful moment was abruptly shattered by the sound of an incoming text message. Her expression soured as she read the display. It was Steve, his message a desperate plea, begging for another chance and proclaiming his undying love for her. Evelyn felt a surge of irritation, tempered by a tinge of guilt, as she quickly typed a response. "We're done, Steve. It's time to move on," she wrote, her fingers tapping the screen with force. But Steve's replies quickly escalated from pleading to threatening. "If you leave me, I'll make you regret it," he warned. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her anger flaring as she furiously typed back. "How dare you threaten me, Steve? You are nothing but a plaything, a distraction from my boredom. You think you can scare me? You're pathetic." She spat out through her text, her words sharp and cutting. Her finger jabbed the "send" button before she blocked his number, cutting off any further contact. Throwing her phone onto the couch, she cursed softly, her mind racing with the possible fallout of her actions. Trying to shake off the unease, her gaze inadvertently fell on the open door of Paul's office. Old Betsy, usually a benign presence, now seemed to loom in the shadows, almost like a judgmental observer. She scoffed at the thought, dismissing it as absurd. "I need a drink," she muttered, turning away from the typewriter's silent judgment. As she walked away, the room fell into a hush, broken only by the faint, eerie sound of typewriter keys. Unheard by Evelyn, 2 more letters were typed, L and L. On the paper, stark and ominous, the word "kill" was now complete, a chilling harbinger of the tangled web Evelyn had woven. Chapter 7: Desperation in the Shadows. The back alley where Steve found himself was a stark departure from the clean, orderly streets of the suburban neighborhoods he was accustomed to. It was a place forgotten by time and society, where the darkness seemed to cling a little tighter, and the air was heavy with despair. Graffiti-covered walls loomed over piles of trash that lined the narrow passage, the stench of decay permeating the atmosphere. This was a part of town that most avoided, a haven for the desperate and the dangerous. Under the dim light of a flickering street lamp, Steve stood facing a shady character, a man whose eyes were as cold as the steel he peddled. The surroundings were desolate, the silence punctuated only by distant sirens and the occasional scurry of rodents in the shadows. It was a place devoid of hope, where every transaction was a gamble between life and death. In Steve's eyes, there was a crazed, almost manic glint, a far cry from the confident, composed fitness instructor he usually presented to the world. As he held the gun, his hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with a mix of anger and exhilaration. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, a sense of power and control that had been missing from his life recently. The dealer, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, regarded Steve with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "What's a pretty boy like you doing in a place like this? What do you need a gun for?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. Steve bristled at the comment, his pride wounded. "It's none of your damn business," he snapped, the words laced with venom. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a roll of cash that he tossed to the man. The dealer caught it deftly, his expression unchanging. "Pleasure doing business with you," the dealer said, his tone implying anything but pleasure. He turned and disappeared into the darkness of the alley, leaving Steve alone with his new acquisition. Steve gazed at the gun once more, a sinister smile creeping across his face. He turned and walked back to his car, a classic Chevy Mustang 5.0 from the 80s. Its once proud frame now seeming to echo an accomplice to his dark intentions. Sliding into the driver's seat, he placed the gun on the passenger seat, its presence a stark reminder of the path he was about to take. With a roar of the engine, he sped out of the alley, leaving the squalor and despair behind. As he drove, his thoughts were consumed with Evelyn, the woman who had scorned him, played with his emotions, and shattered his heart. The road ahead was one of revenge, a path he never imagined he would tread. But now, with the weight of the gun beside him, Steve felt a dangerous resolve settling over him, a resolve to make Evelyn pay for the pain she had caused. Chapter 8: Descent into Chaos. In the rapidly descending twilight of their once peaceful day, the atmosphere in Evelyn and Paul's home had transformed from one of tranquility to palpable tension. Earlier, Evelyn had gone shopping, intending to surprise Paul with a home-cooked dinner, something she hadn't done in months. As she bustled around the kitchen, preparing the meal with a newfound sense of purpose, she playfully shooed Paul out with a large kitchen knife. "Go relax or find something to do, this is my treat for you," she insisted with a smile. Paul, with a contented sigh, retreated to the next room. He sipped his coffee, his mind wandering through the recent changes in their lives. He reflected on how engrossed he had been in his writing, fearing he had neglected Evelyn. But now, as he considered their conversations about starting a family and her joyful reaction, he felt a renewed sense of commitment to balancing his aspirations with the needs of their relationship. He felt incredibly fortunate, the luckiest man alive, as he contemplated their future together. Lost in these thoughts, Paul wandered into his office, where old Betsy sat in the warm sunlight. The sight of the word "kill" typed boldly on the paper jolted him from his reverie. Confusion and concern clouded his mind as he wondered how the ominous word had appeared there. Could Evelyn have typed it? His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the doorbell's insistent ring. Evelyn called out from the kitchen, asking Paul to answer the door. With a sense of unease, Paul set aside the paper and went to see who was there. Opening the door, Paul was met with the unnerving sight of a young man with a disturbingly intense gaze. "Are you Paul?" the man asked, his voice edging on desperation. Paul, sensing something off about this man, replied cautiously, "I'm Paul." "And who might you be?" The young man clenched his fists, his body tense with barely controlled rage. Standing there, he felt a deep-seated hatred for the wimp before him, the loser for whom Evelyn had left him. It infuriated him more seeing this scrawny rich prick before him. As Paul asked again who he was, Steve's internal struggle reached a fever pitch. Just then, Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, and upon seeing Steve, her face drained of color, fear etching her features. In a split second, Steve's pent-up fury erupted. He drew a pistol from the back of his jeans and opened fire on Paul. 3 shots rang out, and Paul stumbled backward, collapsing near the open office door. Evelyn's scream pierced the air as she witnessed Paul convulsing on the floor, his lifeblood staining the carpet. Steve turned his crazed attention to her, his sense of power and control inflating his ego. He threatened Evelyn, demanding she submit to him in the most degrading way, right there in front of her dying husband on her knees. Evelyn, paralyzed with fear and disbelief, pleaded with Steve to stop, her mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. Steve, however, basked in his perceived dominance, pulling her close with the gun pointed at her temple. But as he tightened his grip on her hair, expecting a broken, defeated woman, he was met with a fierce, defiant glare. Evelyn's sudden cry of "fuck you" was the last thing Steve expected as she plunged the large kitchen knife deep into his groin with a swift, upward thrust. The shock and agony dropped Steve to the floor, his hands clutching his wounded groin. Evelyn, now in control, picked up the dropped gun and fired 2 shots into Steve, ensuring he was no longer a threat. Standing over Steve's body, Evelyn was momentarily lost in a trance of fury and survival. but Paul's bloody coughs brought her back to reality. Dropping the gun, she rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to stem the flow of blood. In the office, old Betsy sat in silence, an unseeing witness to the chaos and violence that had unfolded just beyond her keys. Chapter 9: The Night of Broken Pieces. The storm raging outside mirrored the tempest in Evelyn's heart as she sat alone, submerged in the deepest recesses of despair. The living room, once a haven of shared dreams and laughter with Paul, now felt oppressively empty, echoing with the ghosts of what could have been. She clutched a bottle of alcohol, her tears streaming down unchecked, each droplet a bitter testament to her anguish. Evelyn's mind was a whirlwind of torment, replaying the night's catastrophic events like a macabre film. The police, the blaring sirens of the ambulance, Paul's limp form being carried away, these images haunted her. She remembered sitting vigil at the hospital, her presence a silent prayer for forgiveness, a forgiveness that seemed as distant as the stars. Her world had unraveled when her affair with Steve was exposed amidst the chaos. The scornful eyes of Paul's mother, branding her a harlot, still burned in her memory. But it was her own mother's slap, a physical manifestation of her disappointment, that shattered Evelyn's heart into irreparable fragments. The words of disownment from her parents were a cruel knife, twisting deeper with each sobbing breath. As she was driven from the hospital, chased away by the very people she longed for comfort from, the reality of her isolation struck hard. Now, in her storm-lashed home, with the remnants of an unfinished dinner growing cold in the kitchen and the bloodstains on the carpet screaming accusations, her grief was a palpable entity. She contemplated the cruel irony of life. How had her pursuit of fleeting affection led to such devastation? Her choices had not only endangered Paul's life but had alienated her from everyone she loved. The weight of her actions, the sheer magnitude of the destruction she had caused, was suffocating. Lost in her sea of sorrow, Evelyn's heart pounded with fear at the sound of the typewriter keys clattering in the study. Was it her mind playing tricks, or had her nightmare taken on a new, terrifying dimension? Gathering the remnants of her courage, she armed herself with the zapper from her purse and approached the office. Pushing the door open with a trembling hand, Evelyn braced herself for what she might find. The room, bathed in the dim light of a solitary lamp, was eerily empty, yet the sound of typing persisted. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the typewriter, old Betsy, a once familiar object that now seemed to exude a malevolent presence. The keys were moving on their own, relentlessly striking the paper. With each mechanical stroke, the word "kill" was hammered out, over and over, forming a macabre tapestry of letters that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. Evelyn's heart raced with mounting terror. The surreal scene before her was like something ripped from the pages of a horror novel. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen malevolence that seemed to emanate from the typewriter itself. As she stood there, frozen, her mind struggled to make sense of the impossible. How could this inanimate object harbor such a sinister force? Was it her guilt and grief manifesting in this ghastly spectacle? Was she going crazy? Her instinct to flee kicked in, and she spun around, desperate to leave the room and its haunting apparition. But as she turned, the door swung shut with an ominous thud, cutting off her escape. The sound of the door sealing her fate was like the final note in a symphony of dread. Trapped, she faced the typewriter again, only to find the keys had ceased their eerie dance, the room now enveloped in a suffocating silence. Evelyn's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The walls of the office seemed to close in on her, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The typewriter, with its relentless message of "kill," loomed larger in her vision, a symbol of the nightmare her life had become. In that moment, the boundaries of reality and madness blurred, and Evelyn found herself caught in the grip of an overwhelming fear, a prisoner of her own haunted conscience. As Evelyn sat frozen in the office, the oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by the emergence of a ghostly apparition. It was a spectral entity, chillingly similar to the haunting figures often depicted in horror films. Ethereal and unsettling, it materialized out of the shadows, its form both nebulous and disturbingly human-like. The figure seemed to be composed of swirling mist and darkness, its movements eerily smooth, gliding towards her as if moving through thick, unseen water. Evelyn's eyes were wide with terror, her body immobilized by an intense, primal fear. The apparition's approach was silent, yet it filled the room with a palpable sense of dread and despair. This ghostly figure seemed to embody the culmination of all her guilt and terror, a physical manifestation of the nightmarish spiral her life had taken. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were bottomless pools of darkness, staring into her very being. In that harrowing moment, Evelyn's mind was engulfed in panic and disbelief. She desperately wanted to scream, to break free from the paralyzing fear, but her voice was trapped, a silent cry in her constricted throat. The room grew colder as the apparition neared, the air itself seeming to thicken with an unspoken ominous energy. Then, as the spectral figure reached out towards her with its indistinct, shadowy form, an unnerving, deathly silence enveloped the house. Time appeared to stand still, the world suspended in a moment of eerie calm before a storm. In this haunting silence, Evelyn's fate was sealed, marking the end of her presence in the mortal world. Aftermath. Months later, Paul returned to the home that had once symbolized their shared happiness. The physical and emotional scars he bore were reminders of the price of love betrayed. He limped through the house supported by the cane the hospital gave him. The house had been cleaned by his family, the remnants of that dreadful night erased, but the memories lingered like shadows. In his office, the one place untouched by the hands of others. There, he found a typed letter from Evelyn. Dear Paul. As I sit to write this, words fail to express the depth of sorrow and regret that I feel. I'm leaving this letter for you, not as a goodbye, but as a confession and an attempt at closure for us both. I have betrayed you in the most unforgivable way. My affair with Steve was a mistake, a catastrophic lapse in judgment that I will regret for the rest of my life. It was never about love with him, it was a misguided search for something that I thought was missing, but in reality, was always there with you. The night he came here, his actions, though driven by his own madness, were a consequence of my betrayal. The chaos and pain that ensued are on my shoulders. Your blood, and even Steve's, are on my hands. I see that now, more clearly than I have ever seen anything in my life. I watched you fight for your life in the hospital, surrounded by machines and tubes, a sight that will haunt me forever. I wanted to stay, to scream out my apologies, to beg for your forgiveness, but I was chased away by the very people who once embraced me as family. Perhaps rightfully so. I've been disowned by my own family, but that pain pales in comparison to the thought of having lost you forever, not just as a husband but as the friend and partner you have always been. I want you to know that despite everything, my love for you was real. It was pure and true when we stood together, exchanging our vows, and it remains so, even as I write this. But I understand now that love is not just about feelings, it's about actions, respect, and trust, all of which I have irrevocably damaged. I am leaving to find a semblance of peace, to maybe one day forgive myself for the hurt I have caused. I wish for you a future filled with happiness, love, and trust, the kind of future we dreamed of but one that I have now made impossible for us together. Please find it in your heart to move on, to find happiness again. You deserve that. You deserve someone who will love and cherish you, someone who will stand by your side as I failed to do. Goodbye, Paul. Thank you for the love and the beautiful moments we shared. I will always cherish them. I hope, in time, you can think of me without pain, and perhaps, with a faint smile for what we once had. Forever sorry. Evelyn. Her words, a mix of confession, regret, and resignation, lay next to her wedding ring on the desk, symbols of a love lost and a life derailed. Sitting there, Paul pondered his future, the emptiness of the house echoing the emptiness in his heart. As he contemplated his loneliness, the typewriter sprang to life, typing, Chapter 1. A small, meek smile crossed his face. Of course, he whispered to the silent room. It always begins with Chapter 1. Sitting down with old Betsy, he began to type, the rhythm of the keys a balm to his wounded soul. In this act of writing, he found a flicker of hope, A path forward through the darkness.